Good evening, friends. Take a deep breath in and let it out slowly. Let your mind loosen its grip on whatever it's been holding today. The emails, the traffic, the tiny arguments with yourself about whether you really needed that second cup of coffee. None of that matters now. Dim your lights. Let the room soften into shadow. Pull your blanket around your shoulders like a gentle promise of warmth. And tonight, let me take you to a place that has outlasted every headline and every empire. A place where the mountains remember everything. If this slow journey helps you rest a little easier, you can tap that like button or subscribe. Only if it feels right, of course. For now, just breathe. Because we're going somewhere that moves at the speed of dust and prayer. Imagine the first light of morning creeping over the Hindu Kush. It isn't a noisy sunrise. The sun does not shout here. It simply slides its pale gold fingers down the rock faces, touching valleys that still sleep beneath shawls of mist. Down there in the silence, a shepherd pours tea into a metal cup, so thin it rings like a tiny bell. The steam rises slowly, a small ghost dancing over his hands. If you listen closely, you might hear a goat bleat, a dog shake itself awake, and the crackle of a fire made from twigs collected yesterday along the riverbank. That's how most mornings have begun in these mountains for centuries. To an outsider, Afghanistan can look like a wilderness, stitched together by stone and silence. But if you stay quiet long enough, you realize the silence is a language. It tells stories. It remembers footsteps. Alexander's soldiers complaining about the cold. Persian traders weighing saffron and lapis. British officers scribbling in leather journals as their horses snorted steam into the frost. And later, Soviet boots, heavy with mud and certainty. Then American boots, heavier still with gear and good intentions. But underneath them all, the same soil, the same people who know how to outlast weather and war simply by waiting a little longer than anyone else. The mountains of Afghanistan are terrible and tender in equal measure. They crush armies and cradle villages. They are not spectators. They are participants. When the wind slides through the Khyber Pass, it carries the dust of centuries, the fine powder of broken swords, sun-whitened bones, crumbled forts, and the hopes of men who thought they could redraw the world. Yet even as history was being written in blood, someone was baking bread in a clay oven. Someone was feeding a baby. Someone was teaching a child to pray. That's the part history books forget to whisper about. I like to think that if you stood still on a ridge long enough, you'd feel time itself breathing around you. Each gust of wind a chapter, each stone a comma, in an endless sentence about stubbornness and faith. Now picture the late 1970s. Somewhere between Kabul and Kandahar, radio voices sputter across the static, half Russian, half Pashto, like two streams trying to share the same bed. Villagers hear rumors, new machines, new soldiers, new promises of modernity. But Afghanistan has heard promises before. It knows that modernity usually arrives on someone else's truck and leaves before winter. The Soviet Union rolled in with helicopters and red stars painted on steel. They brought roads and maps and an astonishing belief that mountains could be governed by a blueprint. Imagine being a general from Moscow, used to flat lands and straight lines, suddenly finding yourself staring at terrain that looks like a crumpled tablecloth thrown across the earth. Every valley a trap, every ridge a pair of watchful eyes. And the people, oh the people, they smiled politely, offered you tea, and waited for you to leave. Because they knew the secret, you will leave. Everyone does. That's not a threat. It's just geography with a sense of humor. Afghanistan doesn't defeat invaders in the dramatic sense of movie battles. It defeats them with boredom, distance, and time. The roads are long, the valleys narrow, and the local hospitality dangerously disarming. A guest today might be an enemy tomorrow, but you'll still get a second cup of tea because manners are manners. The Soviets stayed nearly a decade. They built airfields and schools and tunnels, but the ground beneath them kept shifting, not just geologically, but spiritually. Every village had its own tribal story, its own small leader who answered not to Moscow or Kabul, but to his grandfather's ghost and his neighbor's trust. When foreign tanks arrived, the villagers simply folded their tents and moved 3 valleys over. They didn't need victory. They needed endurance, and endurance is the one commodity Afghanistan produces in abundance. Some say the mountains fought the Soviets, but really, it was the rhythm of life that did it. When you wake with the call to prayer and sleep beneath a sky so full of stars, it feels like the universe is leaning closer to listen. You learn patience, and patience outlasts politics every time. One winter night in 1986, a Soviet convoy wound its way through a snow-choked pass. Engines rumbled like sleepy beasts. Headlights cut yellow paths through the flakes. Inside one armored vehicle, a young soldier from Belarus pressed his hand against the glass, trying to see something beyond the white. All he could see was his own reflection. He wrote in his diary later that the snow looked like ashes and the mountains like ghosts with shoulders. He left in 1989. The mountains did not. When the Soviets withdrew, the world moved on. But Afghanistan did what it always does after foreigners go home. It turned inward and listened to itself. The whispers that had been echoing between villages grew into voices that called for a different kind of order. A promise of purity and piety, of justice that felt local instead of imported. Those voices would soon call themselves the Taliban. But for now, in the late 80s, they were just students with books and beliefs, and a sense that God might be on their side if they kept their hearts clean and their guns oiled. The mountains watched them too, small figures against an endless sky, gathering momentum like a whisper that refuses to fade. And the wind carried their prayers down to the villages, across the fields, into the tattered homes left by wars that no one could remember starting. The USSR had collapsed, the West had lost interest, and Afghanistan was alone again. Which, to be honest, was exactly how it preferred to be. If you were to stand on a mountain ledge then and look down at the country, the broken roads, the patchwork fields, the villages curled into valleys like cats around a fire, you might have thought it was a place forgotten by time. But that was the illusion. Afghanistan wasn't forgotten. It was waiting for the next empire to get confident enough to try again. And while it waited, life went on in its usual uneventful, beautiful way. In Herat, a teacher reopened his classroom and used chalk so old it crumbled like powdered snow. In Kandahar, women traded spices in a market that smelled of cumin and dust. In Kabul, a young boy learned how to fly a kite from his rooftop and watched it tug against the wind, as if it wanted to escape history itself. All small acts of defiance, quiet proof that life doesn't need permission to continue. And so, the mountains whispered again. They whispered of past invaders and future ones, of the fragile peace that always sits on the edge of a blade. Their echo rolled through the valleys, a low humming sound that might have been wind, or might have been history clearing its throat. If you're still awake, let your breath slow with that rhythm. In and out. The air of Afghanistan is thin, but it teaches you how to breathe deeply because you must. And in that breath lies the entire lesson of this land. The long inhale of waiting, the soft exhale of endurance. As the night settles over the mountains, the fires in the villages blink like amber stars. Somewhere, a flute plays a melody so old no one remembers its words. The shepherd from earlier has gathered his goats, poured his last cup of tea, and wrapped himself in a blanket against the cold. Above him, the sky is a bowl of silver light, and the mountains whisper their endless story again. That empires come and go, but the land remains patient and unmoved. And as we leave that ridge behind, feel your own breathing steady with the pulse of the earth. The next chapter will arrive like a slow sunrise over these ridges, where the world changes names, but the mountains never do. Good evening again, friend. If you're still here, I hope you're comfortable. Maybe lying on your side now, one hand tucked under your cheek. The lights are low, the world has quieted, and outside your window perhaps there's the hush of distant cars or the soft complaint of a night breeze. Let those sounds fade behind this one, the rustle of time itself, brushing over the mountains of Afghanistan. Tonight, we walk deeper, down into the valley that waited for no empire. Imagine following a narrow dirt path that winds from the high passes into a basin of slow rivers and apricot trees. The air grows thicker, warmer. You can smell dust, sweet fruit, and the faint metallic scent of stone that has been sunburned all day. The valley below seems still, but it's alive in quiet ways. A boy driving donkeys along the water's edge. Women laughing as they rinse clothes in the shallows. The dull clink of a blacksmith's hammer that keeps its own patient rhythm. To the left, an ancient watchtower leans like an exhausted soldier. Its bricks are older than many countries. They've seen banners come and go, each promising forever. But this valley never bothered to listen. It simply waited. Not out of defiance, but because waiting is what valleys do best. When invaders ride through, the hillsides stand very still, like actors pretending to be part of the scenery. They know that the noise will pass, and afterward the goats will wander back, nibbling at the same stubborn grass. I once read that British officers in the 19th century called Afghan valleys time traps. They meant it as a warning. Once you marched in, you began to lose hours, then days, then purpose itself. The mountains confused your maps, the silence swallowed your orders, and by the time you found a way out, the valley had already erased your footprints with dust. Picture a small village at dusk. Mud walls glowing gold in the low sun, smoke curling lazily from clay chimneys. Someone is baking bread. You can hear the puff as the dough hits the inner wall of the tandoor. There's laughter from the courtyard, the kind that happens when work is done and stories begin. This isn't the laughter of victory, it's the laughter of survival, that quiet, tired joy of people who made it through another day. They've seen empires arrive with trumpets and leave with excuses. So when another one comes, they put on the kettle and say, "We'll see." In 1839, when the British first marched into Afghanistan, their uniforms were bright as parrot feathers against the dust. They brought silver cutlery, tea chests, and a complete sense of destiny. The valley watched them too, those long columns winding like a red ribbon between brown cliffs. For a while, the locals traded with them, sold hay and milk, shared gossip, and then watched the ribbon fray. By the time the snow melted, the British were gone, not defeated in one grand battle, but quietly undone by distance, hunger, and the invisible weight of the land's patience. Decades later, the Soviets would follow the same roads, though paved now and echoing with engines instead of hoofbeats. Their trucks carried propaganda posters, radio towers, and optimism carefully packed in metal crates. Yet each evening, when the engines cooled, they too would hear it, that low breathing of the valley, as if the earth itself was reminding them, I was here before your revolution, and I'll be here after. When night falls here, it doesn't fall all at once. It pours in slowly, like ink diffusing through water. The first stars appear over the ridge. The sky deepens from blue to indigo, and somewhere a generator coughs and falls silent. The world shrinks to the glow of oil lamps and the murmuring of prayers. The call to prayer in a mountain valley sounds different from anywhere else. It's thinner, almost shy, like a flute played through fog. You can imagine it brushing across the stones of a ruined fort, startling a few drowsy birds and fading into the dark. Sometimes the wind itself feels like it carries voices, old soldiers talking in their sleep, mothers whispering to sons who never returned. Or maybe it's only the shifting of the air, pretending to be memory. Either way, the valley keeps its secrets. There's an old saying among the elders, the mountain has teeth, but the valley has a memory. The meaning changes depending on who you ask. Some say it's about revenge, that even if the fighters die, their children remember. Others say it's simply about continuity, that life here endures by remembering where the water flows, which stones hide shade, which path leads home. Memory, not might, is how Afghanistan survives. During the long years of war, villages became invisible by habit. A convoy would approach and shutters would close. Men would vanish into orchards. Women would gather the children and move toward caves that smelled faintly of smoke and mint. Then, when the noise passed, life resumed exactly where it left off. It's a rhythm as old as the hills. Hide, wait, reappear. The valley does the same each season. It sleeps beneath snow, then wakes with poppies. If you were walking through it now, you'd feel that rhythm under your feet. Every pebble, every path is part of a larger heartbeat that doesn't hurry for anyone. You might see an old man repairing a wall that's collapsed 20 times in his life. He hums while he works, pressing each stone with care, as though repetition itself were a kind of prayer. In a way, it is. When the Americans came in 2001, they brought satellites and sensors, drones that could see a heartbeat from the sky. And still, the valley refused to be hurried. Technology can find heat signatures, but not patience. You can't map loyalty or boredom, or the way news travels faster than sound in a place where everyone's cousin knows everyone's secret. The Americans called it asymmetric warfare. The villagers called it Tuesday. I once imagined what the valley might say if it could speak English. Maybe something like, "You're all very determined, but I have seen determination before." It doesn't last as long as erosion, and then it would go back to growing apricots. Some nights, when the moon is full, the valley looks like it's glowing from within. Silver light dripping down terraces, turning irrigation channels into threads of mercury. Children chase each other between shadows. Elders sit cross-legged, sipping tea that tastes faintly of smoke and cardamom. The tea glasses clink softly, a kind of applause for nothing in particular. It's just evening. Just another night that the valley survived. You might wonder, what keeps people here, in a place that has known so much invasion, so much rebuilding? Maybe it's the soil. It's thin, rocky, and temperamental. But once you coax it into life, it rewards you with wheat that gleams like sunlight and melons sweet enough to make you forget the dust. Maybe it's the feeling of belonging to the ground rather than owning it. Or maybe it's simply stubborn love. the kind that says, "If the mountains haven't left, why should I?" Every culture has its lullabies, but Afghan lullabies often sound like tiny history lessons. A mother might sing about kings and kites and rivers that never stop flowing. Even in sleep, children learn that everything changes except the land beneath their dreams. As I tell you this, imagine the slow rocking of a cradle, the quiet hum of that song. The melody floats through an open window, out into the dark, where it tangles with the sighing wind. And the wind, as always, carries it farther than any army ever traveled. If you're still awake, and maybe you are, hovering between waking and rest, notice how your breath has matched the pace of this valley, steady, unhurried, patient. That's the real secret of endurance, not strength, but rhythm. The same rhythm that beats beneath centuries of conflict and calm. The valley waited for no empire because it didn't need to. Empires wait for victory. Valleys wait for morning. Morning always comes. Sometimes late, sometimes pale and cold, but always enough to begin again. And as dawn edges over those hills once more, the shadows retreat, the orchards stretch awake, and another day starts exactly like the first one centuries ago. A shepherd calls his flock. A woman lights her stove. A child throws a stone into the river and watches the ripples fade. The valley sighs. The world continues. Now, as you drift towards sleep, let that sigh be your lullaby. A reminder that persistence is quiet, that history moves slowly, and that even the deepest wounds of time can soften beneath a sky full of stars. And as we leave this valley behind, listen, the wind is still talking, the same old language of patience. Our next step will take us into the dust and radio crackle of new voices. But for now, let the silence of the valley keep you company. Close your eyes. Breathe. We'll move on when morning comes. Good evening again, my wandering friend. If you're still with me, then you've made it through the passes, crossed the slow rivers, and found a soft place to rest in the heart of Afghanistan. You've seen the mountains whisper and the valleys wait. Now, let's step closer into the small courtyards, the tea houses, the quiet corners of daily life, where history doesn't march or roar. It hums softly under its breath. Picture the afternoon light turning honey gold, dripping down the mud brick walls of a village on the edge of Kandahar. The air trembles with warmth. Dust floats lazily, curling like cigarette smoke. Inside a low-roofed tea house, old men sit cross-legged on carpets the color of faded sunsets. There's the soft clink of glass against metal trays, and the faint hiss of boiling water on a coal stove. Someone adds cardamom pods to the pot, and the scent slips into every corner of the room. If you close your eyes, you can almost taste it. Earthy, sharp, slightly sweet, like comfort steeped in patience. Every story in Afghanistan, no matter how violent or heroic, eventually pauses for tea. That's the secret rhythm of survival. Gunfire, politics, negotiations. All these things have their moments, but tea happens every day. It's the punctuation mark between chaos and calm. There's an old proverb that says, "Tea without friends is like war without an enemy." It sounds strange until you realize it means the act of sharing is what makes life real. Even in the harshest times, Afghans brew tea, not because they have enough sugar or time or peace, but because to pour tea for another person is to admit, gently, we are both still alive. Now imagine it's 1996. The world beyond these valleys is full of noise. Presidents, headlines, sanctions, speeches. But here in the tea house, the talk is small and tender. Whose son got married? Who lost a goat? whether the apricot harvest will survive this year's winds. Outside, trucks rumble past, men with turbans and rifles perched in the back, dust following them like a faithful dog. The Taliban are growing, still mostly students then, still sure of their mission, still unaccustomed to the weight of power. They move through the land like a rumor that slowly becomes law. But inside, life continues with astonishing calm. The kettle sings, someone yawns, someone else plays a small radio that hums out a poem set to music. In the corner, a man with a weathered face hums along, tapping his finger on the teacup in rhythm. He doesn't care who rules tomorrow. He just hopes the road to the next village stays open long enough for his nephew to visit. That's the strange beauty of survival in Afghanistan. It's not grand, it's granular. It's made of small acts repeated until they become defiance. Brewing tea, tending sheep, repairing roofs, planting the same seeds again, even after bombs have churned the soil. The war might decide who sits in the palace, but it can't decide who gets the first cup of tea in a friend's home. If you've ever been inside one of these homes, you'll notice the floors are always clean. Even in houses that seem half collapsed, the part where people sit to share food or prayer is spotless. Children run barefoot, laughter echoes off the clay walls, and the smell of bread, naan, fills the air. That bread is life itself, simple, round, warm, soft at the center, crisp at the edge. It's baked on the inside of an oven wall, the dough slapped there by hand, sticking for a moment before it puffs and browns. The sound, thwop, hiss, crackle, is a lullaby of survival. I once heard an aid worker describe Afghanistan as a country that cooks hope for breakfast every morning. She meant that even after everything, decades of conflict, shifting alliances, broken promises, people still light their fires and prepare food as if peace were coming at noon. Maybe it's habit, maybe it's faith, or maybe, deep down, it's the simple human instinct that says, if I make tea today, someone might join me tomorrow. And they usually do. Guests arrive without announcement. Sometimes it's family, sometimes strangers, who appear from the road with dust in their beards and a story in their eyes. You never ask who they voted for or what side they fought on. You ask, have you eaten? Hospitality isn't about politics here. It's about decency, a shared understanding that the world outside is difficult enough, so the inside should be gentle. Now, as the sun slips behind the ridges, the color of the village changes again. The mud walls go from gold to amber, then to a shade that might as well be sleep itself. A cool breeze wanders in through the narrow streets, carrying the scent of wood smoke and cumin. Children chase one another, kicking a ball made from wrapped cloth. Dogs bark, then give up, curling themselves into piles of fur and sighs. You can hear a flute somewhere, faint, almost shy, playing a tune older than memory. Maybe it's about love or loss, or just the rhythm of the road. Music in Afghanistan isn't always loud or public. Often it's like this, a whisper that knows it might be forbidden tomorrow, so it plays softly tonight. The man with the flute might stop mid-note if soldiers pass by, then resume once they're gone, as if nothing happened. This is what survival sounds like, an unfinished song that never stops being remembered. By the late 1990s, Afghanistan had learned to live inside itself. Borders meant little. News from the outside arrived like rumors drifting in with the wind. There were no clear lines between peace and war anymore, only degrees of quiet. Some valleys heard gunfire every night, others heard only crickets. And in both, life persisted. Women drew water from wells, mended clothes, whispered verses of poetry to their children. Men fixed tractors with wire and faith. People adapted the way rivers do, flowing around whatever blocked them, never losing their direction completely. You might think that living through such uncertainty would make people bitter, but often it makes them funny instead. Dry humor, the kind that tastes like strong tea. Ask an Afghan farmer how things are, and he might shrug and say, better than yesterday, worse than tomorrow, and then laugh. That laughter isn't despair, it's armor. It's how you tell the universe you're still here. Let me tell you about a man named Rahim I once read about, a school teacher in a northern town during the early 2000s. Every morning he walked an hour to a one-room school, carrying a piece of chalk wrapped in paper. The blackboard was cracked, the windows were just holes, and sometimes he had only 3 students. But he taught anyway, geography, poetry, whatever he could. When asked why he kept going, he said, because I'm teaching the future to be stubborn. That's Afghanistan in one sentence. Outside his classroom, there was a pomegranate tree that somehow bloomed every year despite the dust. He used to say, it grows because it doesn't know it shouldn't. The same could be said of the people. As night deepens, the village falls quiet again. The last lamps flicker out one by one. The sky, vast and silent, fills with stars, so many that it looks like someone spilled silver across velvet. Somewhere, a muezzin's voice calls out the night prayer. The echo bounces off the hills, stretching the sound into eternity. It's soft, not commanding, more like a reminder than an order. Time passes, life endures. Sleep if you can. If you listen carefully, the whole country seems to breathe in rhythm with that call. Inhale, hope, exhale, memory. Over and over for centuries. The tea house from earlier has gone dark, but the kettle still holds warmth. The cups are stacked, the coals dying to a soft red glow. Tomorrow, they'll relight it with a single spark, because there's always another morning, another conversation, another pot to share. That's what survival really is. Not heroism, not conquest. It's the promise that there will be tea again, dust again, songs again, and between them, maybe a little laughter. So as you settle deeper into your pillow, let that rhythm carry you. Imagine the taste of cardamom on your tongue, the quiet hum of conversation, the slow swirl of dust in a sunbeam. You're safe in this story now, suspended in a place where nothing rushes and nothing lasts forever. And when sleep finally comes, let it arrive like evening in that old village, slowly, gently, without fanfare. Because even dreams, like Afghanistan, survive by patience. And as we leave this tea-stained chapter behind, follow me quietly. Our next path leads into a longer shadow, where empires rise again and learn, once more, how to kneel before the mountains. Good evening again, dreamer. If you've made it this far, I imagine your body has grown heavy with calm. Your blanket has found its perfect shape around you. The air feels still, maybe cool against your face. Somewhere, a clock ticks, gentle and predictable. Not to measure time, but to remind you it's still passing, even here in the soft glow of the story. Tonight, we turn to a new chapter in Afghanistan's long, slow tale. The part where 2 superpowers, the USSR and the USA, both tried to conquer the same stretch of sand and ended up learning the same sleepy lesson. You cannot hurry a land that does not care about your calendar. Imagine standing in a desert valley near Helmand province at dawn. The horizon is pale gold, the air so dry it feels like glass. Nothing stirs at first, not a single breeze. Then, from far away, you hear the faint hum of engines. They rise and fade like waves. Soviet convoys once passed this way, their metal shells glowing red in the sun, dust coiling behind them like smoke from a funeral. Decades later, American Humvees would follow the same tracks, same dust, same disbelief at how endless the horizon seemed. To the mountains, it was all one long sigh. Empires come, empires go. The wind remains the only reliable reporter. If you've ever been in a desert, you know how silence there has texture. It isn't empty. It buzzes softly, heat shimmering, tiny grains sliding, insects murmuring under rocks. That's the kind of silence Afghanistan specializes in, full of small life that refuses to be noticed. You can imagine Soviet soldiers trying to sleep under that silence, the sand still warm from the day, each grain of it clinging to their uniforms like glitter that refuses to wash off. They'd roll over, restless, thinking of birch forests thousands of kilometers away, and wonder how a country could be so large and so invisible at once. During the 1980s, the USSR poured men, machines, and money into these mountains. Helicopters thudded like slow hearts across the sky. Villages were bombed, rebuilt, bombed again. Maps changed colors. But the landscape didn't notice. Somewhere in a nearby valley, a farmer was planting barley as his father had, carefully pressing the seeds into the same soil that had already swallowed countless ambitions. Soviet soldiers kept diaries, and if you read them now, the ones that survived the weather, they sound less like war journals and more like letters to boredom itself. "We drive all day. The mountains never end," one wrote. Another, "There is tea here stronger than any vodka." A few even fell in love with the stillness. One wrote, "The stars are so many here. It feels like we are buried beneath them." Perhaps that's what Afghanistan does best. It humbles you with beauty until you forget why you came. And then, years later, when the USSR finally withdrew, their tanks rolling homeward across frozen rivers, the same stars watched them leave, unblinking, unimpressed. The Soviet dream dissolved, as quietly as steam from a samovar. But history has a funny sense of timing, doesn't it? It waits just long enough for one empire's footprints to fade before another shows up with cleaner boots. And so, after a brief pause, just long enough for Afghanistan to rebuild its tea houses, its hopes, and its heartbreak, the next great visitor arrived, the United States of America. The year was 2001. Half a world away, skyscrapers had fallen, and in the ashes, a promise had been made to chase the shadows back to their caves. Afghanistan became a destination once more, not for traders or explorers this time, but for drones, journalists, and dreams of justice. I remember seeing footage of that first autumn in Kabul. Planes descending through the thin blue air, soldiers stepping into a land whose history could have filled their entire library, but whose patience would soon outlast their entire mission. They arrived with night vision and satellites, and still couldn't see what the shepherds already knew. Mountains do not surrender, they simply wait for winter. There's a peculiar kind of irony in how history repeats with slightly different uniforms. The Americans built bases where Soviets once camped. They drank bottled water instead of tea, wore Kevlar instead of wool. But the rhythm was identical. Patrol, ambush, rebuild, repeat. A cycle of presence without progress. Even their jokes began to sound familiar. One soldier wrote in an email home, "We're doing the same thing the Russians did, but with Wi-Fi." In the evenings, after missions, the soldiers would sit under the desert sky, listening to the whine of generators and the distant laughter of children they never saw. They'd talk about home, about sports, about the weirdly comforting smell of diesel mixed with dust. Some would play guitar, the chords carried away by dry wind. Some wrote poetry, bad poetry mostly, but poetry nonetheless. And maybe that's the proof that war itself can't kill softness, it only hides it. Meanwhile, in villages nearby, life continued with almost comic consistency. People still bargained for onions, still argued about cricket matches, still turned their faces toward Mecca 5 times a day. They had learned long ago that big powers come with big promises and leave with bigger disappointments. So they smiled politely, took what they needed, and waited again. Always waiting. By the mid-2000s, the Americans found themselves learning the same lesson the Soviets had learned 2 decades earlier. That control on a map isn't the same as control on the ground. A road you pave in spring might vanish by summer, washed away by rain or by disinterest. A village you think is yours might turn out to belong to whoever offered the freshest bread that morning. Afghanistan doesn't reject outsiders violently at first. It confuses them gently to death. Every hill looks like the next. Every victory feels temporary. And before long, you find yourself counting sunsets instead of enemies. There's something humbling about that, to realize you're fighting a place that fights with silence. It doesn't roar, it erodes you. Some nights, soldiers from both sides, Soviet then, American later, would lie awake listening to the same sound. Wind scraping against tents, sand ticking softly against metal, a faraway dog barking once and then giving up. That's when homesickness sneaks in, not as pain, but as longing for predictability. For snow that falls the same way every year, for traffic lights, for grocery stores. In Afghanistan, even the weather feels revolutionary, and yet, for all the hardship, there were moments of grace. Soviet soldiers trading cigarettes for bread, American medics handing out candy to kids, small kindnesses that never made it into the official reports, but which meant more to the people than any treaty. If you look at photos from those years, any of them, you'll see the same expression on every foreign face, a mix of wonder, fatigue, and a hint of surrender. Because somewhere deep inside, each of them realized that Afghanistan wasn't a battlefield. It was a mirror. It showed every empire its own reflection. How pride turns to confusion. How purpose melts into routine. How the mightiest nations can find themselves humbled by a place that measures time in centuries instead of seasons. Even the word Afghanistan carries a rhythm that feels older than politics. 4 slow syllables, like footsteps on gravel. It sounds tired but unbroken. Just saying it feels like dust in your throat and light on your skin. Sometimes, I imagine the mountains themselves keeping score, not with numbers, but with stories. This one brought tanks, they might whisper to each other. That one brought drones. All of them brought confidence. All of them took home dust. There's an old Afghan saying that captures it perfectly. You have the watches, we have the time. It's not a taunt. It's a lullaby of inevitability. A reminder that patience always outlives precision. So here, in this chapter, we let the superpowers rest a little. They fought enough for one lifetime. Let them lay down their weapons beside the dunes, close their eyes under the indifferent stars, and learn, as every army before them has, how to sleep in the sand. Listen closely now. The desert wind is slowing. The hum of machines fades to a heartbeat, steady and human. In the distance, maybe a single fire still burns, a soldier's camp, a shepherd's home, or just a traveler keeping the cold away. The flames flicker orange against the dark, casting shadows that look like history retelling itself for no one in particular. If you're still awake, let your breath follow that flicker. Inhale, dust and warmth. Exhale, peace and fatigue. In this moment, you are neither victor nor vanquished. You are just part of the long, slow rhythm of the earth. Tomorrow, someone will wake to the same sunrise. They'll make tea, sweep the sand from their doorstep, and begin again, as always. Empires will forget them. The mountains never will. So rest now. Let the sound of the wind become your lullaby. Because even the superpowers, eventually, must learn how to rest. And the sand, patient as always, will cover their footprints until only the quiet remains. Good evening again, traveler. You've crossed the mountains, wandered the valleys, shared tea with strangers, and seen superpowers learn to nap in the sand. Now, we reach the long twilight of the story, that stretch of time when history loses its shape, and no one quite remembers how it all started. It's the part of Afghanistan's tale where the war itself becomes a tired old ghost, mumbling to itself in the dark. Tonight, we'll drift through that ghostly place, where guns rust faster than memories fade, and everyone keeps living because no one knows what else to do. Imagine the sound of mourning in a country that's been at war for 40 years. It doesn't sound like sirens or gunfire anymore, just life rearranged around uncertainty. A rooster crows, late but confident. A radio crackles with the voice of a man reading poetry instead of news because the transmitter broke months ago. A child laughs somewhere, chasing a tire down a dirt road. And under it all, the low hum of generators, the steady rhythm of survival. Brrrr, like the purr of a tired civilization still trying to stay awake. By now, the world has changed many times over. Presidents have come and gone. Flags have been raised and lowered, raised again, and replaced with newer slogans. But in the small villages of Afghanistan, the routine remains the same. Morning tea, prayer, tending to animals, cooking, patching roofs, waiting. Always the waiting. If you were to ask an old man in such a village what year the war began, he might pause, squint at the horizon, and shrug. Which one? He'd ask. Then he'd smile, not mockingly but softly, like someone remembering too many stories at once. Because when wars last too long, they stop being events and become weather. You don't fight the weather, you live under it. There are places in Afghanistan where generations have known nothing else. Children learn to distinguish the sound of distant helicopters before they learn the alphabet. Mothers instinctively pause mid-sentence when they hear engines overhead, just long enough to decide whether to keep talking. And yet, meals are cooked, songs are sung, weddings are held, because even when wars forget why they started, life remembers how to continue. Let's take a small walk now, slowly, down a narrow street in Kabul in the mid-2000s. It's early evening, and the air smells faintly of diesel, cardamom, and smoke. The city buzzes with a kind of restless energy, too alive to give up, too tired to celebrate. There are men selling grilled corn on corners, the kernels popping and crackling, motorcycles weaving through alleys like impatient bees, and on rooftops, satellite dishes catching signals from a dozen countries, as if the city itself is eavesdropping on the planet. Everywhere you look, you can see two versions of Afghanistan trying to coexist. One is ancient, the rugs, the calligraphy, the rhythm of prayer. The other is modern. Smartphones, imported sodas, Wi-Fi signals that vanish with the power cuts. Between them lies a country trying to stay awake long enough to dream. The war, or maybe wars, still drifts through it all like smoke. Sometimes thick and choking, sometimes faint and harmless. It's hard to tell whether it's ending or just pausing for tea. I once read an interview with a young man from Kandahar who said, "My father fought the Russians. I fought the Americans. My son will fight whoever comes next." It's like inheritance, but without profit. He said it with a grin. The kind of grin that makes tragedy sound like an inside joke. That's how you survive a war with no beginning and no end. You laugh at it until it forgets its own punchline. Still, not everyone laughs. Some grow quiet instead. A deep, thoughtful quiet, the kind that fills mosques and doorways and long walks home. They've learned that words are heavy when the air itself carries so many memories. In their silence, you can hear an entire history humming. The sound of empires fading, families rebuilding, prayers whispered over empty chairs. Now, imagine a night near Jalalabad. The sky is bruised purple. Stars spill like salt across it. Somewhere in the distance, gunfire pops. Not near enough to panic anyone, just part of the landscape. Closer by, families sit on rooftops, eating dinner under the open sky. Rice, bread, maybe lentils if fortune's kind. A baby cries, a radio plays, laughter drifts between bites, and for a moment, everything feels ordinary again. That's the secret no one tells you about war. Sometimes, it's incredibly boring. There's an Afghan saying, "You can't live forever in the fire, but you can get used to the smoke." That's what most people did, got used to the smoke. They built their days around the fumes of conflict, finding ways to make beauty out of ashes. Girls painted their nails bright colors even when schools were closed. Boys flew kites made of old plastic bags. Merchants sold tulips in marketplaces that had seen tanks roll through. Somehow, the flowers always came back first. Even the Taliban, by this stage no longer students, but rulers again, seemed caught in the same strange rhythm. Their war, once pure in purpose, had stretched so far it looped back into confusion. They'd fought foreign armies, fellow Afghans, even themselves. And now, as foreign troops withdrew one by one, the question floated through the dust. What happens when the war that defined you suddenly stops moving? It's like being a kite with no wind. All string, no sky. Outside observers, far away in offices with air conditioning, like to call this the forever war. But that term misses the poetry of it. It wasn't forever. It was cyclical, like the seasons. Conflict came and went, as predictable as rain that refuses to follow forecasts. You could almost set your watch by it, if watches still worked in places where time bends around survival. In 2021, the last foreign planes finally lifted from Kabul's airstrip, heavy with dust and disbelief. The world watched through screens as the war seemed to fold in on itself like a collapsing tent. For those on the ground, it wasn't shock, it was déjà vu. They'd seen this movie before. Different actors, same script, same ending. Foreign flags replaced, foreign languages fading into the hum of generators, and the land exhaling once more. Finally. Alone again, but even then, the quiet that followed wasn't peace. It was more like a pause, an intermission between acts. Afghanistan has always been good at intermissions. They stretch just long enough for someone to think the play is over. And then, somewhere in the back of the theatre, another story begins. For the people, life simply resumed, as it always does. Markets reopened, weddings resumed, roads filled with honking again. There were new rules, new uniforms, new slogans. But the same old dust underfoot, the same old mountains watching without comment. Children still laughed, women still prayed, men still argued about prices and politics over cups of tea that tasted exactly the same as they did 50 years ago. That's the strange grace of Afghanistan. Permanence disguised as change. Everything shifts, yet nothing really moves. If you were to ask the wind itself when the war began, it might answer like this: I don't remember, but I remember the songs, because even when everything else fades, songs survive. Lullabies, folk tunes, verses murmured by men walking home at night. Melodies stitched together from loss and longing, hummed by those who have forgotten who they're mourning. I like to imagine one such song floating over the plains tonight, her voice low and steady, carried by the air, weaving between minarets and poppy fields. The lyrics mean little in translation, just a simple refrain. Every morning is borrowed, every night returns. It's not about victory or defeat, it's about continuity, the slow persistence of being alive. So if this war has forgotten its own beginning, maybe that's for the best. Maybe forgetting is how peace begins, not with treaties or applause, but with a collective exhale, a mutual decision to stop remembering for a while. Maybe that's the truest form of surrender, when everyone, tired beyond words, agrees to sleep. And speaking of sleep, let your own breath match the country's now. Slow, uneven, hopeful. Inhale, dust and dreams. Exhale, release and rest. Outside, the wind keeps humming through the ruins and the rebuilt homes, a lullaby for a land that refuses to stop telling stories. The war might have lost its plot, but the people never lost their pulse. And as we leave this chapter, imagine walking away from the battlefield, not in triumph, not in fear, just walking softly, as if leaving a room where someone has finally stopped arguing. The air is clear again. The night is calm, and far ahead, beyond the noise, waits a country that has outlasted everything except hope. Now, close your eyes and let the war sleep too. Good evening one last time, my friend. You followed me through mountains and valleys, through whispers and winds, through tea houses and trenches. Now we come to rest, not in triumph, not in defeat, but in stillness. The kind of stillness that comes when a story has said everything it needs to say. Tonight's tale isn't about war anymore. It's about endurance, that quiet, invisible thing that hums beneath every sunrise in Afghanistan. So take a slow breath. Let your body sink deeper into comfort. Your blanket has turned to the soft weight of peace. The air is cool, calm, and forgiving. If you wish, close your eyes. The story can keep speaking even while you drift away, because this is the kind of history that doesn't need to be seen, only felt. Somewhere north of Kabul, the sun is rising over a field of wheat. Each stalk bends gently in the breeze, brushing its neighbor, whispering its small part of an ancient song. A boy runs between them, his laughter mixing with the wind. He has never known peace by name, but he has known mornings like this, golden and endless, where the world feels briefly untouched. That, perhaps, is peace enough. In the distance, mountains cast long shadows over villages built from the same clay that's been underfoot for thousands of years. A rooster calls, a door creaks open, smoke rises from a chimney. An old woman steps outside to light her stove. Her hands are lined like riverbeds, her face calm as a page already written on. She doesn't talk of governments or generals. Her prayers are shorter, for rain, for bread, for her grandchildren to come home safely. That is the quiet arithmetic of hope here. One loaf, one hug, one more morning. Afghanistan has always been this, a collection of small eternities hiding inside vast chaos. While maps are redrawn and headlines roar, daily life continues like a soft drumbeat. Someone repairs a shoe, someone weaves a rug, someone sings while cutting fruit, and above them all, the sky, endless and indifferent, keeps its promise of light. You might wonder how a country can outlast the plans of the entire world, how it can stand still while everything around it collapses and rebuilds. The answer is simple, though not easy. It never agreed to the plans in the first place. For centuries, outsiders have arrived with ideas, neat lines, systems, manifestos, democracies in packages, empires in uniforms. They all came convinced they could make the land behave differently. But Afghanistan has a habit of looking at blueprints and smiling politely. Then it does exactly what it's always done. Waits, adjusts, survives. It's not rebellion, not really. It's more like weathered wisdom. The knowledge that every empire believes it's permanent until winter comes. The British thought they'd teach governance. The Soviets thought they'd teach equality. The Americans thought they'd teach freedom. The mountains listened, nodded, and kept on teaching patience. That's the thing about endurance. It doesn't argue, it outlives. If you travel today through the countryside, you'll still find traces of all those ambitions. A rusted Soviet tank, half buried in sand, now used as a chicken coop. A broken American road sign pointing to nowhere. British coins, dull and green, buried near a riverbank where children skip stones. Artifacts of certainty left behind by those who thought the world could be shaped like clay. And the Afghans, quietly amused, simply reuse them. Old helmets become water buckets. Empty shells turn into planters for basil. Nothing is wasted. Even history gets recycled here. At night, when the power flickers out, as it often does, families sit beneath the stars instead. Someone will point out constellations, naming them not after Greek heroes, but after stories from their own mountains. The archer, the goat, the caravan of lost merchants. They'll laugh, sip tea, maybe argue about whether that faint sparkle near the horizon is a planet or an ancestor keeping watch. And somewhere in that laughter, in that act of looking up instead of down, you can feel what it means to outlast the world's plans. There's a village near Bamiyan where the cliffs still bear the scars of the great Buddhas, those ancient statues that once watched the valley in silence for more than 1,000 years. They were carved by hands that believed in eternity. They were destroyed by hands that believed in purity. And yet, even now, when you stand at their feet, you feel presence, not absence. The space where they stood hums with memory, as if stone itself refuses to forget the shape of devotion. It's as though Afghanistan understands that endurance is not always about preservation. Sometimes it's about resonance. You can erase an image, but not its echo. That's how this land works. It doesn't hold on to everything. It simply absorbs and transforms. Invaders become neighbors, enemies become footnotes, ruins become landmarks, and time, slow and patient, covers every wound in dust and poppies. If you walk through Kabul now, you'll see young men selling phone cards beside crumbling monuments, and children taking selfies near old tanks that haven't moved since before they were born. It's strange, isn't it? How technology and history can share the same sidewalk. But that's Afghanistan. Contradictions leaning comfortably against each other, both knowing neither will win. You might see a woman walking briskly with her headscarf fluttering, earbuds hidden beneath, listening to a love song she'd never admit she downloaded. Or an old man selling books of poetry, Hafez, Rumi, Iqbal, as casually as if they were newspapers. Every page, every breath, a reminder that identity here isn't something fragile. It's something woven, mended, rewoven. In the evenings, when the city hums and cools, people gather on rooftops. They bring out food, rice studded with raisins, lamb cooked slow, mint yogurt, and sit cross-legged as twilight paints the sky a soft violet. Conversations drift lazily from politics to gossip to poetry. Someone tells an old joke about British officers getting lost. Another laughs about the time a Soviet tank ran out of fuel in front of a mosque. The laughter is gentle, never cruel, because after everything, humor is the last proof that a people still own their story. The children chase each other around the water tanks, their laughter echoing down into the streets where shadows grow long. You can almost hear the city sighing, as if saying, "We are still here." Not perfectly, not peacefully, but here. And that, after so much forgetting, is a miracle in itself. Sometimes I think Afghanistan is less a country and more a rhythm, a pulse of endurance beating under centuries of noise. It doesn't rise or fall. It simply continues. It's the heartbeat of a shepherd walking the same trail his ancestors did. The rustle of wheat that grows on fields once ploughed by empires. The echo of prayer between mountains that never cared about borders. Even when history tries to bury it, the rhythm hums on, steady and sure. So when people ask what will happen next, I think the land just smiles and says, the same thing that's always happened, life. Because life here isn't a reward, it's a ritual. Each day begins not because yesterday ended well, but because the sun, faithful and impartial, keeps rising anyway. And now, as night settles once more over those stubborn hills, you can almost feel the weight of peace trying to return. Shy, uncertain, like a stray cat testing a doorway. There are still struggles, still shadows, still endless debates about what the future should be. But beneath it all, there's something older than war, older than politics. The simple will to exist, to plant, to love, to remember. That's how a country outlasts the world's plans, by refusing to stop living while the world figures itself out. Let's pause here. Listen. You can hear the sounds of night sweeping over the land, the flutter of prayer flags, the soft laughter from a nearby courtyard, the faint trickle of a stream feeding a patch of wheat somewhere in the dark. And high above, the wind moves through the mountains again, the same wind that once carried Soviet dust, American smoke, British songs. Now, it carries only silence, a kind of holy silence that feels like forgiveness. If you're still awake, let that silence wash through you. Let it soften your edges. Let it remind you that endings aren't always loud. Sometimes they're just a long, slow exhale. Because Afghanistan's story doesn't really end. It just rests. Like an old warrior finally setting down his sword. Like a storyteller finishing a tale and smiling quietly to himself. So may you rest too. May you find in your own heart a bit of that same endurance. The strength to keep breathing, to keep waiting, to keep believing in gentle tomorrows. And as this story fades, as the embers of history glow one last time in the dark, remember this. The world may plan, predict, and promise, but the land, and the human spirit that lives upon it, always finds its own way. Good night, traveler. May these memories guide you into peaceful dreams. And if you drifted off somewhere in the middle, that's all right. The mountains don't mind repeating themselves. They'll be here tomorrow, whispering to anyone who still listens. Sleep well, friend. Until our next story.